Welcome to Finding Faith in Fandoms. I'm your host, Jacqueline Tatro, and today I have two guests instead of one. We have returning guest Amelia Smith. Hello. And at long last, we have also her husband, Kenny Smith.
How do you do?
Like Amelia and myself, Kenny is a graduate of Gordon College. That's where these two lovebirds met. He's been a frequent participant and sometimes leading member of Still Small Theater, which is a Christian nonprofit theater group on the North Shore of Massachusetts. Kenny, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jackie.
Since this is your first time here, would you mind sharing a little about yourself?
Yeah. So I like to say I've always been a Christian. That's obviously not technically true, but since I was young enough to decide I was Christian, I was Christian. That's not to say my faith has been stagnant. It's definitely grown and changed as I've come into adulthood. As an artist, I have always loved stories. I read a lot when I was younger, a wide variety of things, lots of classic lit, but other things as well. I have always loved fantasy. Most recently, my artistic endeavors have focused on tabletop role-playing games and making my own stories through creating the worlds for my players to enjoy. And that is definitely one of my passions now. And as far as stories go, another one of my passions now is anime. I've delved deep into the genre that I totally missed out on as a kid and have been absolutely hooked by some anime recently. So,
Well, thank you guys so much for joining me for this topic. I feel like we're always saying that we're so excited about the story that we're covering, but this is actually one of my favorites of all time. Today we are covering the classic English novel Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. A little background on the story. Charlotte Brontë published this 3-volume novel in 1847. She was part of a very literary family. She and her sisters Emily and Anne Brontë all wrote novels and poetry. Jane Eyre has been adapted to stage and screen, movies, and miniseries countless times. More recently, it was adapted into a stage musical by Paul Gordon and John Caird. That was first produced in 1995. A new version was made in 2018, and we recently saw the live streamed production by Theatre Rally in September 2024, which sort of has a smaller cast. There are some changes to the soundtrack and score.
And it's excellent, and if any community theater directors or people who have any influence in community theater, especially around the North Shore of Massachusetts, are listening to this, find out how to get the rights for that version. Mm-hmm. Please, we want to do it so bad.
It's really beautiful, yeah. I recently found a manga graphic novel adaptation, which is really well done. The Manga Classic series adapts a lot of famous works of literature.
I first read the book in high school, absolutely fell in love with it, and then a friend introduced me to the musical version in college and fell even deeper in love, because I think that is one of the best stage adaptations or musical adaptations of a book that I've ever seen. And I introduced Kenny to both.
and I think we were going to go see the musical. And so in preparation, I listened to an audio version of the book because I wanted to get the book story first.
And I'm just so glad that we've been able to enjoy the story together, that he doesn't just like it for my sake, but you seem to enjoy it on your own.
I quite like this story. I readily acknowledge that I am not exactly the target demographic for this story, but it is a good story. I love some of the things that it does, where it takes some tropes and it twists them just right.
I'm still disappointed there are no werewolves.
Yes, I totally thought this story was going to take a Gothic horror turn and have, like, vampires and stuff.
Spoilers, no werewolves.
Growing up in school, I did read a lot of classic lit stories that this very much pulls from, and I see some of the tropes that this story sets up and how it changes them, and I love it for that. And not only is it good subversion of expectation, but it's just, it portrays relationship in a much better way. Much more realistic, much more healthy. Not that there's inherently something wrong about the trope itself, but this is just so much more honest and so much more human.
Yeah, it's very realistic in one sense. It blends more fantastical elements with a kind of realism or groundedness, maybe.
I think what I loved about the story when I first read it in high school was that Jane is just so relatable. Or at least I found her very relatable. She is more introverted than a lot of typical literary heroines. She does not consider herself to be attractive. She says what's on her mind. She keeps a lot of things to herself. But when people ask for her opinion, she gives it honestly, which there's just something very real and honest about the way she sees herself. She's very perceptive about other people and aware of their flaws as well as their strengths. I don't know if you said exactly that, but you talked about this portraying relationships in a more realistic light and less like romanticized. The reason I love Jane Eyre so much is because she is aware of her own flaws. She is aware of other people's flaws as well, but instead of trying to hide her flaws or trying to excuse other people's, she chooses to focus on the good qualities and try as much as she can to be the best version of herself, even when that means making some very hard choices, and try to encourage other people to deal with their flaws while still accepting and while still loving them and encouraging them to be better people than they would be if they just ignored those flaws or were covering them up.
Can I chip in a little thing? Hearing
Yes.
you talk about that, Amelia, reminded me how much you relate to this story, and I wish that I had read this story before we started dating. Just because there's so much good stuff in here that guys don't usually know about.
Like about the female psyche or about relationship dynamics?
Yes, but a little less of like the female psyche and a little bit more of like the female situation, if that makes sense. So, guys, even though you're not the target demographic, if you're in the dating scene, maybe read this book.
Yeah. Well, and the thing I find most beautiful about it is how Jane really desires a relationship where she can be in an equal partnership with someone. I mean, she spends the whole book in these relationships that are unbalanced in one way or another, and she's really striving for an equal partnership with somebody, and that's what she most desires in a romantic relationship, but also in her friendships and family relationships. And she refuses to settle for anything less, and I really admire that about her, because that's something that I think is very important in any type of relationship, but especially in a lifelong partnership. Being able to see one another honestly, see one another's weaknesses, but also appreciate one another's strengths and really be able to interact and communicate and make decisions together as equals rather than some of the other dynamics that you see in a lot of fictional and real-life romances. Let's be real. A lot of romantic tropes rely on people not being honest with each other, and Jane intentionally rejects that. And I think it's really cool to see a book, especially from this time period, pushing for marriage to be an equal partnership at a time when that wasn't really the expectation at all.
Yeah. So I first read Jane Eyre in high school. I took AP English, and I think I loved it, well, for many reasons, but two kind of stand out. One is how it's largely about Jane learning to balance her passions with reason and not be at an extreme for one or the other. The other reason I related to her was more personal. I mentioned in our premiere episode that I have ADD. That made elementary school and my early childhood just difficult in many ways, academically and socially. It wasn't anything like Jane's school experience in the book, but I could relate to the feeling of not being understood. And like Jane, before I started doing things like medication and therapy, there were times when I lashed out physically at classmates who antagonized me on the playground or things like that, and thought that I was justified because they provoked me. So yeah, I'm not proud of that part of my life. But like Jane, I also had a sort of transformative experience as I got older, like in my teen years or preteen years. And that was also when I started learning more about my faith and taking it more seriously. And so I could relate to how she kind of turns her life around at a young age. There's that gap of her teen years where she just sort of becomes a different person than she was as a child. I could relate to that kind of shift in your life. And a big thing with ADHD is that you have difficulty with emotional regulation and with self-control, controlling your impulses and things like that. And that's part of what Jane learns to do. Not all of my teachers were very understanding. This was in the early 2000s. Autism and ADHD and things like that were not as understood or accepted. I was very blessed to have parents who advocated for me and pushed for me to get accommodations at school. I didn't make it easy for the teachers all the time. If any of the teachers or aides who helped me at school are listening to this, I'm sorry and thank you. I've come a long way since then. But I also had great aides and teachers who did help me and saw potential in me and tried to nourish that, like my music teacher, Mrs. Gross, who made sure I stayed involved with music even when I didn't want to perform. And I also had great English and creative writing teachers along the way. That kind of mentorship and encouragement really helped give me the confidence. And my mom homeschooled me for 6th grade, which was a good year for me to mature. I can see the grace of God in how my life kind of turned around at that age. So yeah, the story is deeply personal to me in some ways, but then also it just resonates with a lot of my values and principles. I was an English major and I took a lot of British and Romantic Lit classes in college, so I do want to talk a little about the background of Jane Eyre as a novel. It's a Gothic novel, and that was sort of an offshoot of the Romantic literary movement. And the Romantics sort of were pushing back against the Enlightenment and its emphasis on rationality, like reality is what you can observe. So the Romantics were more into contemplating the divine, the supernatural, and with Gothic fiction, that's usually characterized by the presence or the threat of the supernatural. So like ghosts, werewolves, vampires, and often it has to do with the past intruding on the present. So that's why you see skeletons in the closet, dark family secrets, hauntings, the sins of the fathers being visited on their children, things like that.
We see that past haunting the future as early as some of the first chapters of the book when she's afraid of the Red Room because someone died in the Red Room.
So this is something I was thinking about. Even though Jane Eyre, it's the story of a woman's life. It's told like a biography or a memoir. But it could have been framed differently. Like, what if it was framed as these 3 families or households? There's the Reed family, the Rochester household, and then the Rivers family. And Jane sort of comes in and out of each of their lives. Like, she's almost a ghostly presence in the role that she plays with each of them, reminding them of past mistakes or bringing to light a dark secret or turning out to be someone's long-lost relative. All these tropes, but they sort of go backwards because Jane is the main character. So a lot of things
Plot twist. I am the ghost.
Yes. Yeah. So it's really interesting. And there are some elements of the story that reflect the author Charlotte Bronte's own life. She attended a very harsh boarding school. She lost 2 older siblings in childhood, and she and her sisters sometimes found work as either governesses or school teachers. It's an interesting mix of different genres and sort of pushing the boundaries of genre. It's got fairy tale elements, even though it's a very realistic kind of setting and situations. You see echoes of Cinderella, Bluebeard, Cupid and Psyche, just lots of different tropes from more fantastical stories. I don't know if we want to touch on this. I feel like it should be mentioned. There's this whole debate about whether Jane Eyre is a feminist story or not. It's tricky and a bit misleading to put modern labels on older stories and characters. I can definitely see it as a sort of proto-feminist work in the ideas it presents because, yeah, as we were saying, it's advocating for women's equality, at least in certain spheres, in relationships. Jane talks about how women need work and activity just as much as men. Like, they're not meant to be coddled by their husbands or content in tranquility. They also have energy and they need to find meaningful things to do.
Even just the fact that it's written in a woman's voice. Like, there were lots of female authors in the 19th century, but not a lot of them, I don't think, were writing in first person.
Yeah.
The way this story is told, with Jane speaking directly to the audience, and she says at several points, "Reader, you must imagine my feelings in this moment," or things like that. The idea that a woman has something to say, she has ideas that other people need to hear, that she needs to be allowed to express. And like you were saying, Jackie, you do have to look at it in the context of the time period. If you look at it with a modern lens, sure, maybe a whole story that revolves around this woman finding the only work that is available to her, which is taking care of somebody else's kid and then getting married, does not look feminist necessarily to a 21st century audience. But just the idea of her being able to tell her own story in that context, the fact that she is telling it and she has very particular ideas about how she wants her story to go, and at times rejects the story that seems to be writing itself for her because it's not what she wants. It's not going to bring her fulfillment or satisfaction or even let her live with herself in some cases. I don't think we can put the feminist label on people who didn't, people's work who weren't using that language, but I find it very empowering as a woman, and it advocates a lot of ideas that I think the modern feminist movement can get behind.
It sounds to me like it's the same sort of discussion that we have with the Bible, right? It's like, are some of these themes that we're seeing in this book or in the Bible, are they feminist by our standard today? Well, no, but they were being spoken to a world that was in a very different situation. To push feminism on in that situation is A, extremely abrasive, and B, just, it's not gonna work.
Yeah. Like, there's kind of only so far you can go. This book can definitely be part of conversations about feminism. Even the definition of that word has changed just over the last 100 years. So that's kind of its own tangent. But yeah, empowerment is definitely a word that I would use to describe Jane's journey. We see her again and again through different changes in her life and different decisions that she makes. She's always working hard, trying to pursue goals and make something of herself, and is ultimately rewarded for that.
Yeah, I think Jane operates from a sense of having agency in her own life. Even when she's in situations where she has very little power, she always has this sense that she has the ability to take action. And it may be very subtle, sometimes it is not, but she does not ever allow herself to feel helpless even when she has very little power to influence circumstances. She is always in control of how she responds to them, which I think is sort of the definition of empowerment. Like, even if you're not being given power, you always have the ability to control how you respond to what's going on.
Yeah. And we haven't even started getting to the spiritual themes of this story. And unlike most of the stories we've covered on the podcast so far, this one is more explicitly Christian in its themes, in the language it uses, in the cultural role that Christianity plays in characters' lives. You could look at it as kind of the story of a soul, to borrow Therese of Lisieux's biography's name. It's about Jane's spiritual adolescence and maturity. The fact that she's an orphan can be looked at symbolically. Orphan stories can represent how we human beings feel estranged from God, but then discover that we have this relationship and this inheritance that is promised to us. And Jane herself has obscure origins, but then discovers eventually her family, her inheritance. But all the time she is searching and longing for a sense of identity, love, and a home.
I can't believe I'd never thought to look at her story that way. It's like, now that you've laid it out, I'm like, oh yeah, that is, like, she almost has her own salvation story in her art, which is very cool.
Yeah. There are many broken relationships between these different figures and different families. Part of Jane's family history is the death of her uncle, who was her mother's brother, and then his wife not keeping the promise to take care of Jane. And Rochester has his own tragic family backstory as well. There are lots of situations of separation or estrangement. Overall, the book is pretty orthodox, but Jane and some of the other characters do talk about the supernatural, and there's sort of this tension of, is this just imagination and superstition, or is there really something beyond rational comprehension going on? There's a passage about like sympathies and signs and ominous dreams, and then at the climax of the story there's this instance of people seeming to be connected across time, but they do attribute it, I think, ultimately to God. So yeah, there's sort of a mix of Orthodox Christianity and sort of less organized religion, spirituality. I don't know. And then we were talking about this before. One of the things that we both really appreciate about the story is Jane encounters many different people with very different expressions of religious belief or practice, and kind of has to figure out which ones are genuine and how to discern God's will and live out her own faith. Through the characters in the story, she shows examples of both good and bad Christian lifestyle. There are examples of hypocrisy and corruption, but then also of genuine Christ-like love and Christian values put into action.
I do really appreciate that about this book. I think it's important to recognize the ways that Christianity has been and still is used in many situations to justify actions that are not at all Christ-like or in line with anything the Bible teaches. There are so many cases where people use their faith to justify abuse, like Mr. Brocklehurst, or to oppress others or take advantage, or even just to judge people, like a character that we encounter briefly late in the book, Hannah, the housekeeper for the Rivers family.
Yes.
And like, good Christian woman, and yet she is very judgmental when she first encounters a random beggar woman who turns out to be Jane, who turns out to be related to her master's family. That's awkward. So it's important for Christians like Charlotte Brontë to call out the ways that Christianity is misused and misrepresented, and to clearly say, that is not what Jesus is about. Here's what Jesus is actually about. Here's what Jesus is actually like. Here's what Christian love in action looks like.
There's so many people who see abusive Christianity like what Jane got at school and write off the entire faith.
Yes.
And a shallow reading of this story would be like, oh, Jane's just so submissive and pliable that she goes along with it anyways. But in actuality, there's such a inner strength of what she does with her faith despite that.
Yeah. It's impressive how this book acknowledges both how flawed human beings are and how religion can be misused and people fail to live up to the ideals or principles that they profess, but then it also shows that those principles are worth trying to live out and end up having a positive transforming effect on people's lives.
Well said.
I don't know how deep we can go into the actual plot. Maybe just sort of like briefly.
I trust you to lead the way.
Well, yeah. So part 1 is about Jane's childhood, and sort of similar to what you were saying about the first person narration and showing a woman's perspective. It also shows the perspective of a child in a way that hadn't really been done before in prior literature. There wasn't much written about children's feelings and experiences, at least not from their perspective. There was some idealization of the child and childhood as the age of innocence. Romantic poets like William Blake and William Wordsworth would explore these things in their writing, but Brontë brought that exploration to the novel, and we see later examples by Charles Dickens and other authors.
I forgot she was pre-Dickens.
Yeah.
So much of Jane's childhood feels so very Dickensian, and I think the takeaway is it kind of sucked to be a child in the Victorian era if your family wasn't wealthy.
Yeah. And the attitudes expressed by her Aunt Reed and Mr. Brocklehurst, basically trying to scare children into good behavior. Like, that was very much the approach, that children are inherently sinful and their spirit needs to be broken in order for them to become moral, upright people. And yet Jane faces the problem of evil at a very young age. At the very beginning of the story, the first chapter, when she's being unjustly punished, she wrestles with, why are the wicked rewarded and the innocent punished? Why do horrible things happen to children? Why do children die? Is there justice in the world? Does God care about our situation? After a traumatic experience with her cousin and her aunt, she is sent to a charity school with just deplorable conditions, and she encounters 2 very opposite figures. The superintendent of the school is Mr. Brocklehurst, and his professed faith is just full of hypocrisy. He's kind of sadistic, wanting to keep the girls in bad living conditions, not caring about their physical health and saying that it's for their souls. But then, in contrast to that, she has a kind teacher, Maria Temple, and she meets a slightly older girl, Helen Burns. And Helen is the one who basically lays out the gospel. Her faith is centered around love, forgiveness, recognizing her own faults, being patient in suffering. She talks about the presence of angels that recognize our innocence, even if the people around us don't. Helen gives Jane a wider perspective of both the material world and of the invisible or spiritual. She encourages her to not be so concerned with whether other people like her or not. That's a big thing for Jane. She knows that no one really loves her. She sees school as a fresh start, but then her aunt lies about her character are passed on to the superintendent, who shames her in front of everyone. But then Helen tells her, no, if you really are innocent and your soul is right with God, that's what really matters.
Helen is, I think, the first Christ figure that we encounter in this story. She teaches Jane exactly what you were saying, that God's love is far more important than the opinions of people around her, and she teaches her this virtue of humility and patience and suffering, which kind of defines a lot of the Christian life. She kind of reminds me of a martyr. Like,
definitely.
She can't do anything about her situation, and in the midst of this suffering that she's powerless to change, she's going to trust God, and she's going to cling to the promise that God loves her even when it feels like no one else does. I don't think that Helen's model of submission and forgiveness necessarily works in the long run.
Yeah.
But when you're in a situation like that, and there is no hope of that changing, or you're not in a position to change it, there is something very Christian and very Christ-like about choosing humility and forgiveness in that situation, and choosing not to let the pain that you're experiencing damage your soul, which is what she saves Jane from.
Yeah. She's an interesting contrast with Jane, because Jane's instinct is to fight back and stand up for herself. And in some situations that is good, but they're very disempowered in this school situation. They're children. They're supported by charity. They're dealing with very powerful figures in control of their lives. And there isn't much they can do. And fighting back would probably make things worse.
It reminds me of what Jesus says about, do not fear those who can kill the body. They cannot touch the soul, but fear losing your soul. And that's, I think, the perspective that Jane needs in that time in her life.
Listening to the audiobook, I realized the way Helen describes herself, a lot of the things she describes about herself fit symptoms of ADHD. She doesn't mean to be lazy or disobedient, but she daydreams and has trouble paying attention. She excels at the subjects that naturally interest her. She enjoys reading about historical figures, and she wants to please her teachers, especially Miss Temple, who she genuinely respects, but she just can't motivate herself. And she blames herself for that, which is a cycle that people with learning disabilities like ADHD often have. And it's hard to know where the line is between your will and your ability. How much is a character flaw and how much is just your mind doesn't work the same way. ADHD involves a chemical imbalance. We don't have the same levels of dopamine that give you a sense of feeling rewarded after you accomplish a task. So it is hard to motivate ourselves to do things that we don't want to do. She talks about how she has difficulty keeping things organized. She doesn't go about her work in an orderly way, which drives her teachers crazy. And Jane finds that strange and says, "It's so easy." Helen's like, "Well, yes, I suppose it's easy for you, but not for me." Then she doesn't hold it against her teachers for being frustrated with her. Personally, I think that this part, well, the book as a whole actually has a good balance of condemning injustice, but also encouraging forgiveness. If you have just one but not the other, that's not good. And then, yeah, Helen becomes a Christ figure, the kind that dies.
Poor Helen. Sad. And
Yeah.
the way Helen talks about how I'm going to my long home. Because she has a family somewhere, but I feel like
Yeah, I think she has a father, at
kind
least.
of not much of a relationship there, and it's just sad, but also beautiful the way she looks forward to being home, truly, at last.
Yeah, her trust in heaven is, I think, something that sticks with Jane.
It is a pretty common 19th century literary trope, like the peaceful death. The person who is like Helen, or like Beth March in Little Women, or I feel like there's several Dickens characters that fit this description, like the person who is secure in their faith, experiencing a very peaceful death because they know where their hope is, and death holds no fear for them. And there might be physical suffering, but their soul is at peace, and that is what we see in the scene, is that peace of their spirit. So I think it is definitely a trope to kind of romanticize and sanitize death scenes in this time period, but it's not just wishful thinking. I think it is intentionally showing the spiritual rather than the physical experience.
Yeah.
It's a symbolism, and that symbolism is especially important for Jane at this point of the story.
Yeah.
Also, like, kind of important for people who are living with the death of peers, loved ones, siblings, family as a daily reality and something that they're going to be much closer to than we are today, typically. Mm-hmm. I think it was actually important for people in that time period who had lost siblings or friends or family members to be reminded that what they may have seen or experienced was painful and sad and messy and scary, but what was happening on another level is ultimately their loved one attaining this sense of peace, of reunion with God that they've been craving. It is a sad thing, but it is, I think, healing and helpful for people who have experienced the death of a loved one to be reminded that this is where their hope lies. God is doing something much bigger than the physical suffering that we see and will take care of them. So, yeah, I think it's intentional that these scenes are often written that way.
Thankfully, Jane is not left entirely alone. The adaptations I've seen often cut out the character of Miss Temple, which is such a shame.
I know, she's like the one other nice person at Lowood.
And it's important that there is an adult in her life who shows her compassion and fairness and actually motivates her in her studies. Like, she wants to apply herself to her lessons so that she can please Miss Temple and follow her example. And she ends up as a colleague of her because Jane, when she gets older, becomes a teacher herself. Mentors are such an important part of life, and it's kind of a shame they take that character out.
Yeah. Without Miss Temple, the character growth that started because of Helen would not have completed and ended up being the Jane that we see at the end. And also, she probably wouldn't have been a teacher without Miss Temple, which means the whole story wouldn't have happened.
Yeah. No.
She definitely wouldn't have stayed at that school.
May not have even survived to adulthood, let's be real. So.
Yeah. No, you need love in your life. Because of Miss Temple, Jane still has someone who cares about her and believes in her and motivates her. There is a gap of time from Helen's death to when Jane is about 18. Jane remains passionate, but she learns self-mastery. She learns not to let her emotions rule her. She's content at Lowood School until Miss Temple leaves. Miss Temple gets married, and so she leaves the school. And then Jane sort of realizes there's a whole world beyond this tiny institution. And it's better by that time. Mr. Brocklehurst is he's not fired, but because so many of the girls die from the typhus epidemic, there's an investigation into the school. The donors set up a council or committee to make decisions about the school, so it's not all the power in Brocklehurst's hands. And so conditions improve there.
Thank goodness.
Yes. Yeah, this was kind of an age of people starting to think about reform and trying to make society better. After Miss Temple gets married, Jane decides to pursue a career change. She's been a teacher, but now she decides to look for a position as a governess. I was doing some research, and the British Library YouTube channel has a whole video essay about the role of a governess in society and why it was sometimes used by authors in novels. Basically, a governess was meant to be not only an educator, like a tutor, but also an instructor in morals for children. And I found that interesting because Jane ends up having that role both for the child she's hired to attend to, Adele, but then also for Adele's guardian, Mr. Rochester, who ends up being sort of like the second most important character in the book. The next large chunk of the story mostly takes place around Thornfield, which is Mr. Rochester's home. It's an old, very large house, or maybe a manor. I'm not sure what you'd call it. There's a lot going on symbolically and psychologically in that house with Rochester and his past, and then the relationship that Jane forms with him. When they first are getting to know each other and having a lot of conversations, they do seem to have a sort of intellectual equality. I think he says something like, I was your equal at your age. He's older. I think he's like 40 or so, where she's like 18. But they both have a sense of imagination. They talk about her artwork and they joke. They have an interesting rapport, which you wouldn't expect in that kind of employment situation. And I know we're gonna probably have some listeners who hate Rochester.
Honestly, I kind of do.
Rochester is interesting. I mean, we should say up front, he's a Byronic hero. And so he's gonna be complicated and morally ambiguous. He and Jane just have such an interesting dynamic from the start.
One of the reasons that I love this book so much is because Rochester and Jane are basically like the Victorian version of Beauty and the Beast.
Yes.
He is, I mean, he calls himself ugly. Jane is like, well, you're not conventionally attractive, but I like you anyway. And he, more than that, is selfish and incredibly spoiled. Kenny and I were talking a while ago about how Rochester is just not used to things not going his way because he's always had money and privilege and power, and he is so used to things going his way that he just does things without thinking about how it's going to affect anybody else all the time. Mm-hmm. But, like, at the same time, I feel bad for him because he, like many people who are in that situation who grow up with a lot of privilege, you get the sense that he never had anyone in his life care about him enough or invest enough time with him to actually teach him how to be a better person.
Yeah.
Like, Jane is the only person who has ever called him out or questioned anything that he's done or said. She's the first person to ever care enough about him to say, what you're doing, what you're saying, the ways that you're thinking and talking about other people are wrong. You're being a jerk. You can do better. Mm-hmm. I want you to do better. And that's such a loving thing. So many people don't get that kind of love that we forget how loving it actually is.
And that immediately draws him to her.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's love at the beginning. It's certainly intrigue. Mm-hmm. But that immediately draws him to her. And it's not long before he realizes he needs that quality in someone who's always with him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rochester knows that he has not lived a good life. But he puts a lot of blame on other people for how his life went wrong. When he meets Jane, I think part of what he finds attractive about her is that she's so innocent. Not only in that she doesn't have experience, but also that she has such high principles and is virtuous. She makes him want to be better. Mm-hmm. But then she also warns him that his reformation should not depend on another person. Because human beings are flawed. We fail each other. Here, I'm just going to read the quote. Yeah. Let him look higher than his equals for strength to amend and solace to heal. He basically says that she is his hope of salvation. But she can't be that. She's not God.
Yeah.
That's such a mature position to take.
Yeah.
Especially for someone who's going through as much tumultuous emotions as Jane is in that time.
Yeah. Well, I think that's before all the trauma
really
picks up.
Yeah. But,
yeah.
Like, she is very wise, very perceptive. And you were talking earlier about the struggle between rationalism and emotion. And Jane does really well at keeping her emotions in check and hanging on to the things that she knows are true or that she believes to be true. even in the midst of great emotional turmoil.
Yeah.
But she's also not afraid to embrace her emotions.
Yes.
She doesn't go to the other extreme. She holds both of them in a balance. Mm-hmm. She keeps her principles tied to her rationale, but she still pursues her emotions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a whole lot that happens. We don't have to get into Blanche and Grimm and all that. I think
that's what really makes me hate Rochester.
Yeah.
But yes, we can skip that.
I think her main significance in the story is that she is supposed to be this model of that time period's standards for beauty or ideals of beauty. Mm-hmm. And Jane is not any of those things. Around this time, Jane is also called back to her childhood home because her aunt, Mrs. Reed, is dying. So John Reed, Jane's cousin, who was the most physically abusive to her, like he hit her, threw a book at her, and blamed everything on her. We learned that he has basically is like the prodigal son without the return home. He wastes all his mother's money, is hanging out with the wrong people, and eventually ruins himself and commits suicide. Oh, gosh. Which then prompts Mrs. Reed to have a stroke, and so she's dying. But she says she wants to talk to Jane. And Jane, being the good person that she is, even though this woman treated her horribly and she actually had vowed to never love her or forgive her, she goes back and she does offer forgiveness. Mrs. Reed shows regret, not so much for how she treated Jane, but for another thing that she did, which was hiding the fact that Jane had an uncle who wanted to adopt her. She told this uncle that Jane had died of typhus at school. So she basically prevented Jane from having a more comfortable life.
She's such a mess. Such a mess.
Yeah, no, she couldn't stand the thought of Jane becoming wealthy while her children didn't. And she just had this really unreasonable aversion to Jane.
There's some kind of drama with Jane's parents, right?
Yes.
Jane's mom was Mrs. Reed's husband's sister, so they're not related by blood, they're related by marriage. And there had been some kind of...
So Jane's mother's family did not approve of her marrying Mr. Eyre, but her brother thought that they were wrong to reject her. I think Mrs. Reed was jealous of her husband's relationship with his sister and then the care that he showed for Jane rather than his own children. Jane spooked her as a child and made her feel guilty for breaking that promise to her husband. And now, on her deathbed, she reveals all of this. She shows regret, but not really repentance. She can't stand to humble herself before Jane or apologize for her actions. She's too proud to admit that she was wrong about her impression of Jane. Like, she believed that Jane was just thoroughly evil. And she blames Jane for putting her in the position to do her wrong. It's so twisted.
Yes. The people in Jane's childhood frustrate me so much. It's like, how do you blame a child that you abused them? But
it's the same sort of twisting.
But people do that all the time.
The same sort of twisting that we saw when she was a child with those kids and how she was blamed for everything, even though Mom knew that it wasn't always Jane. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's messed up.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, Mrs. Reed dies a miserable death.
And then poor Jane is stuck with her two cousins who are also not nice to her. They're basically like her evil stepsisters.
Yeah.
And they're falling apart and they're like, no, Jane, don't leave us.
Yeah. But I like that there is a degree of reconciliation with them. They do bond a little over Jane's artwork. Her hobby is drawing, and Georgiana ends up confiding in her. Mainly, Georgiana is lonely and needs to attach herself to someone and talk about herself. Eliza is the more practical one and wants Jane's help with settling the estate, their affairs and stuff. But yeah, they're both pretty awful, each in their own ways. I realized that Eliza and Georgiana remind me of Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility. It's one of Jane Austen's novels. And fun fact, Charlotte Brontë was not a fan of Jane Austen's work. She thought that they were kind of devoid of actual passion and just too...
Yeah, I think we talked about this when I was reading Northanger Abbey. I could just picture a teenage Charlotte Brontë reading that book and being like, wait, there's actually no crazy wife shut up somewhere hidden in the house? Dah! Throws the book across the room in frustration. Wait, I'm going to steal that idea. So, yes. Maybe was influenced in more ways than one.
Yeah. But so, in Sense and Sensibility, that title refers to reason and emotion. Like, sensibility back then meant, are you sensitive? Are you touched by something that's emotionally moving? Eleanor and Marianne are two sisters in that story. Eleanor keeps most of her feelings to herself and doesn't show when she's going through things emotionally, whereas Marianne is kind of all over the place and gives her heart so completely and so quickly when she thinks she's falling in love, and ends up suffering a lot more intensely because of her unbridled emotions. I don't know if Brontë was intentionally imitating those character extremes, but it feels similar. And Jane reflects that Georgiana shows feeling without judgment, but Eliza shows judgment untempered by feeling, and both of them are not good. But Jane herself seems to be a kind of happy medium between the two extremes. Jane says goodbye to basically that chapter of her life. She doesn't see her cousins again after that.
She goes back to Thornfield, and then things get interesting.
I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, because you've written about this part of the story and Jane and Rochester's dynamic more in depth.
So, Jane returns to Thornfield. Rochester, first of all, tricks her into thinking that he's getting married to someone else and found another governess position for her in Ireland, and he's basically just trying to make her cry. And he succeeds. And she's like, I don't want to go to Ireland. I love you. And he's like, I knew it. I love you too. And she's like, wait, what? And he's like, marry me. And she's like, you're psycho. But I love you anyway, so yes. So they get engaged. They have this very dramatic proposal under a tree that gets struck by lightning, and Jane is like, that's weird and kind of spooky, but I'm sure things will be fine.
There's nothing
Ominous about that.
Nothing to do with divine retribution or...
Spoiler alert, it's romantic literature. If something freaky happens with the weather or the environment, it's always a sign. So Rochester is really rushing their wedding and wants to get through the engagement, pre-wedding stuff as quickly as possible, wants to get married as fast as possible. He doesn't want to have a big fancy wedding, just a simple ceremony. And Jane's like, I'm fine with that. I'm a simple gal. Like, I'll just wear an ordinary dress and plain clothes. He's like, no, let me dress you up, my princess. But we're still gonna, like, basically elope.
Yeah. I think he actually says he wants to pour jewels into her lap. And I think he fancies himself as the fairy tale prince.
Yes.
Carrying her off to a happily ever after. And she's like, she's too down to earth for that.
Yeah.
Her tastes are simple. And part of that is she's never aspired to greater things. Even when she was job hunting, she kept her expectations low. She thought of it as looking for a new servitude rather than pursuing her own happiness. And she has a lot of questions and pushes back a lot when they talk about what their relationship dynamic is going to be. And there seem to be a lot of red flags.
Yeah. Yeah. He is clearly living out some sort of fantasy. And Jane keeps having to remind him, I am not your fantasy girl. I am a person with my own needs, my own preferences, and I'm not going to just play along with whatever you want me to do. First person in his life to probably say that. And they get to the day of the wedding. Well, first. Oh, the night before the wedding. Do you want to talk about that?
No.
The not vampire?
I just wanted to mention that what we see from Rochester in this part here is probably a mirror of what he went through with Adele's mom.
Yeah.
Jane actually says something to that effect. She's like, I won't be your English Celine Varens.
Yeah.
Yeah, like he thinks this is how you express love.
Right.
Especially when you're wealthy. And I'm wealthy, you're poor. Let me do all this stuff for you. Let me give you all this stuff. And she's like, no.
She doesn't want to be his
Doll.
pet. Yeah. Yeah. She wants to be recognized as a person with her own sense of agency, and she wants a marriage of equals, not this power imbalance where she's always receiving everything from him and feels in return like she kind of owes him everything.
So she handles it by trying to put distance between them, refusing to be sentimental, whereas he is just a romantic mess.
Yes.
Lowercase r romantic.
Very much so.
I think the last line of that chapter is that she's starting to see him almost like an idol, like thinking less of the creator and more of the creature. And I think he does the same kind of with her.
Oh, definitely. So the night before this whirlwind wedding, Jane has a terrifying experience where someone comes into her room in the middle of the night. She has her wedding dress and her veil and everything all laid out to put on in the morning. And they take the veil and they put it on, try it on in front of the mirror, and then rip it in half, and then leave with this creepy laugh. It's not the first time that something like this has happened. It's a Gothic novel. There have been at least 2 very freaky late-night happenings.
Incidents.
We didn't even mention, like, the part where Rochester almost burns to death in the middle of the night, or where some random guy shows up and Rochester calls Jane out of bed in the middle of the night to perform first aid on this guy who's bleeding from a bite wound. That's where Kenny thought the werewolves.
Vampires!
Yeah, no, well, Jane actually says that she thinks she saw a vampire, and Rochester's like, you're just nervous, honey. Just pre-wedding jitters. It's fine. And she's like, if it's just a dream, then why is my veil ripped in half? And he's like, let's get married.
So Jane thinks that at least some of this is because of one of the servants, Grace Poole.
Right, well, that's what she's been told. That weird, creepy laugh you keep hearing. Oh, that's just Grace Poole. She's just, don't mind her.
Does
she's
Grace Poole
weird.
Exist?
Yeah, she's
She's a real person.
She is a real person. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
she's
very-
not the one with the creepy laugh.
Yeah, no, and he says, like, basically that she's an eccentric and sometimes does weird things. And
Poor Grace gets blamed for so much that, like, she's just trying to do her best.
yeah. She doesn't have an easy job, and that's why she drinks, and that's why she falls asleep, and bad things happen.
Oh, right. Grace is the one who cares for...
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
So we should probably just drop the suspense and...
Yup.
Massive spoiler, but if you've read the book, you already know, and if you haven't, you've probably guessed it by now. They get to the wedding, and you know the part where the priest says, if anyone objects to this marriage, let him speak now. Somebody actually objects. And it is Rochester's brother-in-law. Wait a minute, he's getting married. How does he have a brother-in-law? Jane is a familyless orphan. He was already married. And his wife, sadly, is severely mentally ill and has been shut up in the attic of his house for the last however many years? 20 years? Who knows? So, quite obviously, there is not going to be a wedding. Everything is very disrupted. They go back to the house. Jane meets for the first time this person who she's heard laughing in the night and has been causing all sorts of havoc, who is Rochester's first wife. And she is angry. She is violent. Interestingly, we were talking before we started recording about a stage adaptation of Jane Eyre by Polly Teal that takes sort of a psychological bent and interprets Bertha, Rochester's first wife, as the passions and the violent nature that Jane tries very intentionally to repress. That's one possible symbolic reading, but she is also an actual person who has been shut away and kept locked up in this house. And it's the 19th century. they didn't really know. It's probably a kinder option than what happened to many other people struggling with mental illness. Rochester tries to provide a safe place for her and a caregiver, poor Grace Poole, who gets blamed for all of Bertha's shenanigans. But it's still this dirty secret that he has tried to hide away and cover up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I would like to take a moment to point out that every time that Bertha lashes out is seemingly inspired by something that happened recently. When Rochester's room caught on fire, it was shortly after he and Jane had a real heart-to-heart for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
When she comes into Jane's room, she's looking at the wedding dress. She is responding to the fact that Jane is about to get married to her husband.
Mm-hmm.
They're not just like random lashings out, although she is violent. She did bite her brother when he came to visit her.
Mm-hmm.
There's still a humanity behind it.
Yeah. And the fact that it is a work of Gothic fiction, a sort of trope or symbolism sometimes seen in those stories is an alter ego or a mirror or a double of a character. Like Jekyll and Hyde. There is something to Bertha being sort of like Jane's counterpart in a way. But also the whole household of Thornfield is almost like Rochester himself or his soul. And Bertha in the attic is his past sins, the things that he is trying to shut away, but that eventually have to be brought to light.
Yeah. A couple of years ago when I was working on the Princess Passion project, which both were a part of, Kenny was my Mr. Rochester for the Jane Eyre video that was the finale of the series.
It was so lovely.
It was, thank you for doing that with me, love. That was really great to get to do. When I was working on the essay that went along with that video, I realized that if you look at Bertha, and I feel bad doing this to Bertha because she is an actual person who has been hurt and misused and deserves to be recognized as a person, but in the context of Rochester's own journey, Bertha is the sin that he refuses to fully let go of, that he thinks that he can just cover up and move on and marry Jane and have all the good things and the good life that he wants to enjoy. But the reality is he can't. He can't have that happiness. He can't have that intimacy with Jane that he's craving while there is this sin that has a hold on him. And so many times we try to do that with God. We want to have the relationship. We want to experience belovedness and abundant life, and we want all the perks of being in relationship with God. But we don't want to let go of our little secrets, our temptations, our ways that we treat people that are unhealthy. And we can't have that full relationship with God while we're still holding on to those sins. They have to be brought to light, and we have to let God deal with them. And if we aren't ready to let them go, we can't have that intimacy with God, that full relationship. Which is exactly what Jane does. She wants so badly to marry Mr. Rochester. She loves him wholeheartedly. And she recognizes that if she lets him have that kind of intimacy with her while holding on to this, not just to Bertha, but to everything that Bertha represents in his life. And if he's not willing to change that, he's not ready for that relationship with her. It's always going to be tainted. It's always going to be haunted by this secret that now they're both responsible for keeping, that stands in the way of them being able to fully enjoy life together.
Can I quick ask,
Yeah.
when you talk about Bertha representing sin, what is the aspect of it? Because like his marriage to her was not a sin. Is
No.
it his desire for Jane in light of his marriage that is a sin? Or is it the way he treats Bertha? Or is it more symbolic?
I think, well, mostly symbolic.
Mm-hmm.
But I think largely it's the latter too. marrying Bertha was not a smart choice in retrospect, but it wasn't a sin. But the way that he treats her, like, shutting her away and then going off and trying to satisfy his own desires and treating other people, including Jane, like they're just a means to gratify his desires rather than actual people with wants and needs of their own, is what he needs to let go of to be able to have the relationship that he wants with Jane.
Yeah.
I do like that.
He does need to let go of shame, and shame also can stand in the way of our relationship with God. But we also have to deal with the root cause of the shame. Like, we need to let God deal with our shame. Sometimes there are things that we actually should be ashamed of and need to deal with before we can mature spiritually.
My biggest issue with Rochester is he basically deceives Jane and also has her living under the same roof as Bertha, who is not a safe person for her to be near. The fact that Jane is actually in physical danger on some occasions because of her. Rochester is not honest with Jane and would have made her unknowingly complicit in his sin or a sinful situation. They never talk about, why didn't he just get a divorce or annulment or something? Maybe that just wasn't the thing that they did at the time.
That was very, very hard to do in that time period. And also, there was a very complicated monetary, financial deal behind their marriage, if I remember correctly. So it probably would have been something that his family would not have allowed or would have experienced significant shame from. There are all sorts of complicated social politics involved.
Or maybe the Masons wouldn't have let him. But kind of to your point, Amelia, Jane does feel compassion for Bertha and tells Rochester, like, you shouldn't talk so badly about her. You shouldn't be thinking of her this way. It's not her fault that she is mad. That's how they talk about it. But yeah, he basically makes the case, no, she showed her true colors after we were married, and she was all of these awful things. And then Jane has this kind of crisis of conscience. Jane is determined to leave. She realizes she can't be with Rochester in any way. She refuses to be another one of his mistresses. And what I like about her is she doesn't care much about other people's opinions, but she does care about what's right. She cares about God's law, his will, and also she's guided by her own self-respect. She knows she needs to be able to live with herself. Rochester says no one would be hurt by her living with him, which is like such... People use this kind of argument today, too. Like, no one else is hurt by what we choose to do in private or whatever. But she says, no, there's a wonderful passage. She says, I will hold to the principles received by me when I was sane and not mad as I am now. Laws and principles are not for the times when there is no temptation. They are for such moments as this, when body and soul rise in mutiny against their rigor.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. No, it's so good. I was watching last night the video diary series based on Jane Eyre.
Yes, the autobiography of Jane Eyre. So good.
I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it. I didn't know how they could pull that off in that medium and whether it would keep Jane's faith, which it does.
Yes.
There's one video entry specifically about her faith, her convictions, and then at this point in the story, she says, I can't profess my principles, but then not live them out.
Yeah.
She won't give in to hypocrisy when it's convenient for her.
And the scene in the autobiography of Jane Eyre, which I just want to quickly mention, it's a Canadian YouTube web series that is a modern reimagining of the story of Jane Eyre, but they actually, even though they change a lot of the details to fit in a modern context, follow the plot pretty faithfully. And the scene where Rochester is explaining this whole backstory with his first wife and asking her to marry him anyway, she's in her wedding dress, and she says almost nothing in that scene, but she, as he's telling the story, clutches underneath her dress the cross necklace that she showed the audience earlier when she made the video talking about how she became a Christian. And it's just, it says so much without saying a word. Communicates her literally holding onto these principles of what she knows is right and true, even in the midst of great emotional turmoil, because she knows that that's the only thing she can trust when she can't trust herself and apparently cannot trust Mr. Rochester.
Yeah. So Jane leaves. I mean, she stays the night, but then leaves very early without saying goodbye to anyone, and she doesn't take anything from him. She has very little money of her own. And I realized this shows that she is still a teenager. She is still, I mean, granted, she was going through something horrible and emotional and may not be thinking of everything that she should, but she was actually told. So the reason that Mason found out about the wedding was because Jane wrote to her uncle and told him, just so you know, I'm getting married. I guess her uncle had a connection with the Mason family, and so that's how they found out the truth about... Yeah, so...
Forgot about that. Wow.
But then,
good one, Charlotte.
Yeah, there's so much good foreshadowing and setup throughout the novel. It is so well done. It's like, even when there's a crazy twist at the end, it's like, oh, no, it's not random. It's been building towards this. There were seeds planted. So her uncle's solicitor actually tells her, after the wedding ceremony fiasco, he tells her, your uncle's not well, and you should stay put until you hear from him. She could still be his heir, but she forgets about this, apparently, and she runs off without leaving any means of anyone contacting her. So she's basically cut off from her friends at Thornfield, Mrs. Fairfax, who was the head of the household and was a friend to her. She has no plan for where to go or what to do.
And then doesn't she leave her luggage on the carriage
Yes.
or something? Poor Jane. She's such a mess.
Yeah, so she...
I mean, I would be too, but poor thing.
She takes a carriage as far as it will take her for the money that she has, and then accidentally leaves her parcel on there. So she is literally penniless in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
This is pretty capital R romantic. A wandering, lost soul. She tries begging. She can't get work. She's basically starving to death when she comes to the doorstep of this house. And then, as you mentioned, she is turned away by the housekeeper, thinking that this is a suspicious person, you're a stranger. And Jane is just asking for a little food or to speak with the ladies of the house. Hannah, to be fair, she's trying to protect them.
Yeah.
Jane is at the point where she expects to die and would probably welcome death. But then the man of the house, St. John Rivers, comes home at that point and finds her and gets the housekeeper to bring her inside. His sisters, Mary and Diana, take care of Jane and nurse her back to health. Jane doesn't share with them her whole story. She gives a false surname and tells them, I just want to find a place to live and work that I can do.
She'd only told him her real name.
Yes.
This section would have been a lot shorter.
Yes. But she spends a period of time living with them. What I think is very interesting is that Mary, Diana, and St. John are basically the positive counterparts of the cousins that Jane grew up with.
Yeah.
A brother and two sisters. And
Instead of John, you have St. John.
Yes. Yeah, and Mary and Diana, their names are interesting because Mary, obviously, in Christianity, but then Diana is another name for Artemis. Both Mary and Artemis are figures who are known for a couple things. They're both virgins. Us Catholics and Orthodox believe that Mary was and is perpetually a virgin. Artemis was one of the virgin goddesses, and one of her roles was actually the protector of young women. And Mary's also seen as a protector. She took care of and protected Jesus as he was growing up. And Catholics like myself, we pray to Mary for intercession and often for protection. There's a beautiful prayer called the Memorare about her helping those who call on her for help. So I think it's very telling that Jane who is a young virgin and in some ways a Christ figure, ends up living under the care and tutelage of these two women who are named after these two religious figures known for protection and intercession. And St. John's name and the family name Rivers may also have some symbolism. Of course, John is the name of two significant biblical saints. John the Apostle, the Gospel writer, but then even before him, John the Baptist, who was a relative, probably a cousin of Jesus. And he baptized people in the Jordan River. So rivers also have a lot of symbolism and significance in the Bible. So that's just something to keep in mind. Jane lives with them for a period of time. St. John eventually sets her up with a job as a teacher for a small girls' school. And so Jane, she's not quite happy, but she is learning how to be independent personally and emotionally. And then she ends up becoming financially independent through a crazy twist and coincidence.
Plot twist, they're her actual cousins.
So the Rivers siblings' uncle dies, and they learn that they've been cut out of his will. Eventually, St. John finds out Jane's actual last name. He sees it written on a bookmark of hers or one of her paintings. And then it comes to light, Jane is their cousin who inherited. So they have the same uncle. The Rivers siblings' mother was her father's sister.
So, wealthy uncle finds out that Jane didn't actually die and is like, screw the Rivers siblings, I'm going to leave all my money to her instead.
Something like that.
And then they find out that she's the cousin who got all their money, and she's like, oh, but I love you guys, let's share it.
Yeah, so she inherits £20,000, but then it's like, oh, that's £5,000 for each of us. And the Rivers siblings were kind of on the edge of poverty. The sisters were forced to find work that they didn't really enjoy. But now Jane is like, now we can live comfortably and we can live together if we want.
Just a quick note. This is another Christ-like moment that I hadn't even thought of. Jane, after all this suffering, finally receives her inheritance, and she wants to share it with the family that she's found, which is so lovely.
Well, I also wonder if there's an element of she's always wanting to try to work her way to sustain herself. And she does, I think, over the course of this arc, get to that position. Sustains herself modestly, but she does sustain herself. And then she gets this inheritance, and there's a little way in which it's a bit antithetical towards what she's been working towards.
But it allows her to have a relationship of equality with the Rivers siblings, because they have given her so much, even though they have very limited means to start with. And now she is, I think, very happy to finally be able to give back to them. She divides it 4 ways. That puts all of them on equal financial footing, which is what she's been craving all along.
You were talking earlier, Jackie. You were talking about the inheritance being like our inheritance from God.
Yeah.
And I find it really interesting that she comes into the inheritance when she also rediscovers her name. Or starts using her name again.
That's good. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So once again, it almost feels like she's reached the point of happily ever after, but there's still more.
Yeah, whatever happened to Mr. Rochester?
Mr. Who?
Yeah, right? Oh.
Well, yeah.
St. John. Just St. John.
Yeah, so St. John Rivers is another very pious individual that Jane meets, and she finds him very impressive, actually. He has very genuine conviction. He wants to be a missionary and win souls for God, but he is motivated by charitable principles rather than love for other people. Jane senses that distinction even when the Rivers siblings take her in. Mary and Diana have compassion for her and care about her from the start. He sees it as more of a Christian duty to help her.
You know when St. Paul said, if I give all that I possess to the poor but have not love, I am nothing? That is St. John.
Yes. And yeah, he is ambitious and self-sacrificing and focused on ministry as work, as labor, to the point that he suppresses his own emotions and desires. He is actually kind of in love with this young woman, Rose Oliver. She's a good and lovely person and likes him very much, but she is wealthy and he thinks that she wouldn't be well suited for a missionary life. And doesn't even talk to her about it, which is kind of the worst part. He doesn't give her the chance to make that decision.
Yeah.
To consider it.
It's kind of just how St. John rolls, though. He makes decisions for other people and then is like, this is what we're going to do now.
Or this is what God says, which
yes.
is so much worse.
Yeah, he conflates God's will with his own. And then he tries to influence Jane. Well, here's the thing. People will complain about Jane and Rochester's relationship as something toxic. I think Jane's relationship with St. John is actually more toxic because
so much worse.
It's more insidious. He can influence her in a way that Rochester can't. Jane holds her own with Rochester and can push back and win arguments with him. With St. John, he has a charisma that she is susceptible to, and he can convince her to do things that she doesn't want to, like small things at first, like learning a new language to help him prepare for his missionary journey. He wants to go to India, but then he reveals later, he was testing her to see if she would go along with what he wanted and whether she was up to it. It's like, yeah. So eventually he proposes to Jane, not because he loves her as anything more than a sister, but because he thinks that she is best suited to be his partner in ministry. He basically tries to shame her into joining a mission that she doesn't feel called to.
Yeah. It's a different type of spiritual abuse from Brocklehurst. It's not shaming you, but it's being like, oh, well, God told me this. Like, we're supposed to love others. We're supposed to spread the gospel to the world. We're supposed to give up our own desires and wants to do that. So you're being disobedient to God if you don't do what I tell you because God told me to do it.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's so icky.
Yeah. And she kind of falls for it. Not completely, but she is like, I'm going to go pray and see if God tells me the same thing. Mm-hmm. And if he does, I will go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because she's, at that point, I think, even though it's been a while at this point, the temptation that she went through with Rochester is still pretty raw and has left her doubting her own spiritual, moral judgment. So, I think she kind of suspects that maybe St. John is right, and maybe this is God's way of punishing me for wanting a relationship that wouldn't be morally right. Which is not how God operates, but...
If I can jump to the next point, I think it's so interesting that we're talking about how this is almost more toxic than Rochester. This is more insidious to Jane's character. Mm-hmm. This is the point in the story where she's the most spiritually vulnerable. She's been more physically vulnerable, like back at school. But this is the point where her inner life is the most vulnerable it's ever been. Mm-hmm. And this is the first time that we get positive confirmation that God is speaking to her.
Yeah. So, just one more thing about St. John. He tells Jane that she was formed for labor rather than love. And like, okay, brother, first off, that's not how vocations work. We are all called to love and to serve. We're called, above all, to love God, and then right below that is to love each other. And those things are not meant to be in opposition to each other. Love and duty. There's a line in Game of Thrones that love is the death of duty. That's not true. They're actually tied, and we have to figure out how to live that out. Yes, we are meant to work, we are meant to serve, and we're meant to do that out of love. So at this point, Jane and we later learn Rochester also at this moment. They're both at their lowest point spiritually, and they both cry out to God in desperation. And that is when something supernatural happens, something that defies time and space. Well, no, it's at the same time, but defies space. They hear each other's voices. Jane hears Rochester saying her name and just has the sudden conviction that she has to go back. She has to find out what's happened to him.
And Rochester, we later find out, at the same moment, hears her answering, Edward, where are you? Wait for me. Not exactly, but that is what she says.
Yes. Yeah. It reminds me of one of my favorite Bible stories in the book of Tobit, one of the apocryphal books. Tobit and Sarah both are at a point of wishing for death, and they both make a prayer to God asking for help. And that's when he sends the angel Raphael to help both of them. So yeah, Jane returns to Thornfield, only there's no more Thornfield.
There's remnants.
Yeah. Well, in very Gothic fashion, there are these ruins now. Thornfield burned down because of Bertha Mason. She one night set fire to the place and then threw herself off the roof, so she dies. Rochester gets everyone out, but then he is injured. He loses his hand and is blinded, so he can no longer see, and he's lost his home, most of his possessions. I assume he still has some fortune, but he's both physically and financially humbled. And then once Jane returns to him and catches up with him, we see that he's been spiritually humbled as well. Rochester's injuries seem almost a literal fulfillment or manifestation of what Jesus teaches metaphorically in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 29 to 30. Jesus says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. So I think Rochester's injuries symbolize him being purified of his sins. It's painful and leaves him in a humbled and handicapped state, but it also leaves him closer, I think, to God than he has ever been. Like St. Paul, Rochester loses his physical sight, but that really represents his spiritual blindness up to that point. But he regains both. He's achieved some clarity. He realizes that his self-justification, his reasoning for trying to marry Jane when he was already married, was wrong, and that he would have drawn Jane into sin, and he actually thanks God for preventing him, which shows a lot of growth, realizing that God does intervene sometimes by stopping us from doing something that we think we're meant to do.
If we go back to the parallel of the house being Mr. Rochester's soul, you could say he has had some very extreme deconstruction of his faith.
That's not where I thought you were going with that.
I thought you were going to say, like, the purifying flame.
Well, there's that too, but I mean, that's similar, right? That's the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
The purifying flame, like, it burns away the excess, the stuff that we've added there. Mm-hmm. It removes
the walls,
the walls, the barriers, the rooms that separate these shames and sins. Mm-hmm. And it bears our soul. But to us, and sort of also to God. I mean, God always knew it was there, but we are now aware that our soul is bared to God. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Rochester is no longer in the position to see himself as the one lifting Jane into a better life. Now she is financially independent, and he is the one who has nothing to offer by way of material wealth or security.
Yet she still chooses him. He needed that I think, because he's been so used to his wealth and privilege sort of defining how he moves through life, probably has had no genuine relationships with anybody really except for Jane. And then to be in this financially and physically humbled position, and to have her still come back and say, I love you and I choose you. I want to spend my life with you. It's just so beautiful. In the musical, she says, I have come back to you, content, ready to stand here by your side as you see fit, as your friend or as your bride. In the book, she says something similar. It's just like more words and less rhyming. But I think that is so much like the way that Jesus humbly invites us into relationship. We are the bride of Christ as the church, but Jesus never forces us to be that. He says, I stand at the door and knock. You get to choose if you let me in, and you get to choose the role that I play in your life, the relationship that you want to have with me. But I hope you choose to be my bride. Or in Jane's case, to let me be the bride.
Yeah. And if we look at Jane also as a Christ figure, we see that he is now finally relying on God, on Christ, rather than himself. And Jane says she's actually happier. Like, he basically has to be led by the hand to do things. Like, he can't do much for himself now that he is blind and
has
missing
one
a hand.
So.
And he doesn't like having that measure of dependence. Even when Jane first saved him from that fire that Bertha set, he said something about how if anyone else had saved his life, he would have hated to be under their obligation, owing the debt to them. But he doesn't mind that with Jane. But now he really needs her help. But she is happy now that she can actually be of service to him, not just his doll or pet, or like the fairy tale princess that he was making her out to be. I can see why modern day feminist readers would not like that. Jane finds contentment in serving him, but I mean,
it's a mutual dependence, though. She wants to be with him, and he wants to be with her, and is humble enough to rely on her. It probably took some getting used to, but he gets past the shame of being physically reliant on another person because of his love for her. And I think there is something very beautiful about having that kind of intimacy where you can care for someone else and accept help from someone else without shame. I haven't lived that kind of situation to the degree that Jane and Rochester do, but my day job is working with people who provide personal care to people with disabilities. So that's basically what Jane is doing, and to be in that kind of relationship requires trust and vulnerability and a great deal of love, and it is a very beautiful way to choose to spend your life, especially if it is, like Jane is making, something that you are choosing to do out of love for someone.
yeah.
I think, going back a little bit to the feminist conversation, so often our culture, in response to injustices that we have seen, fixates on fairness, but sacrifices love. We're not arguing that the position Jane is in is fair, but it is the love that brings them both to a good relationship. I'm having a bit of a hard time finishing the thought, but you get the idea.
And it's grounded in respect, and she enjoys just being with him. He says, oh, this isn't love, this is pity. Like, you just feel bad for me. And she has to convince him, no, I still have feelings for you. And I would be genuinely happy for my own sake being here with you and helping you.
Rochester, his disability is an important part of his character development, but it doesn't erase who he is. He still has the same mind, the same personality, the same sense of humor that Jane greatly enjoyed before, and their hearts haven't changed. Well, his has, for the better. And their love for each other hasn't changed.
Yeah. The final chapter is so refreshingly happy for the book itself, but then also I feel like for literature of the time.
It's almost like the end of Job.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah. They've been through so much suffering, but then receive so many blessings at the end. Rochester even regains some of his eyesight, and they appreciate that most when he and Jane have their first child and he's able to see it.
And they bring Adele home from the boarding school that she got dumped in after Jane left, and they are reconciled as a family. And it's just beautiful how their love for each other provides healing to both of them. It also provides healing to their relationships with other people. Like Adele finally has a family where she's actually acknowledged and loved, and they have even created a new life out of their love. And it's just so beautiful to see how the two of them coming together, their love not only enriches their own lives, but also spreads and blesses lives around them. And that's what love should be.
Yeah. And Jane does have other relationships in her life as well. She is still in contact with Mary and Diana, and they visit each other each year. She has an extended family as well. The novel ends almost oddly with her talking about St. John, who does go on to be a missionary, and then ends on a very hopeful in the religious sense note. The prayer, Jesus come soon.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense when we're seeing this glimpse of their life being so filled with joy and healing and restoration after everything they've gone through. It points toward the great restoration of Jesus coming back and making all things right between people and between countries and everything that is broken in our world. So that is a very appropriate note to end the novel. I hadn't thought of that before.
The manga rearranges it a little bit so that it ends with Jane saying,
Gosh, that's such a cute illustration.
I have been married 10 years. I know what it is to live entirely for and with what I love best on earth. I hold myself supremely blessed, blessed beyond what language can express. The end. It's so freaking good.
It's very good.
We do see it as a story of a soul, and it ends with Jane finding her purpose, her happiness, a sense of fulfillment, and maybe a glimpse of the kind of happiness that we'll experience in heaven or at the second coming. But yeah, we could talk forever about the merits of this story. It's just so beautiful and so redemptive in multiple ways and multiple levels.
I touched on it earlier. I feel like there's so many stories that begin just like Jane Eyre. Poor lady becomes a governess, and it would end with that initial marriage that was about to happen.
Exactly.
There would have been no Bertha. She would have been married, and then happily ever after. And this is just such a good way of answering that trope. Just being like, no, life is more complicated. That is not a balanced relationship. This power dynamic matters and is very important. This story redeems that trope.
Yes.
Just like it redeems Mr. Rochester and Jane.
Yeah.
I love how much you enjoy this story. I enjoy seeing you enjoy this story and appreciate it, not just because it's something your wife likes, but independently for its own sake. I really like that.
Do you guys mind if I talk about your wedding dance?
Sure.
So I loved on your wedding day how you broke into song, sang this medley of love songs from different musicals, and one of them was the finale of the Jane Eyre musical. brave enough for love. It's such a gorgeous song. It's foreshadowed when Jane meets Helen, and Helen is encouraging her. It basically acknowledges that it takes courage to love, but then also when you have people who love you, you can draw courage from them. Mm-hmm. And also the courage to believe that she can find love and is deserving of real love. And she won't take a counterfeit, like when St. John proposes to her.
Or when Rochester offers to love her while also holding on to his past.
Yeah, she wants the real thing. Yeah, it's just so beautiful, so inspiring. Thank you both so much for being a part of this long but wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting us into this conversation. And I'm sorry that we're giving you so much to edit down.
Don't worry about it. Listeners, I will include links to some of our references and recommendations in the show notes, including the link to Amelia's essay and the related music video with Amelia and Kenny as Jane and Edward Rochester. You can find more content like this on our website, findingfaithinfandoms.org. Please check out our Patreon and social media. We really appreciate your support. Thanks and God bless.